Lynda Gratton é uma referência global quando o tema é o futuro do trabalho. Há 20 anos, ela investiga e ensina a matéria na London Business School, onde é uma das professoras mais premiadas. Gratton é também uma das primeiras colocadas na lista do Thinkers 50, que reconhece os maiores pensadores da gestão no mundo. E como fundadora da HSM Advisory, ela aconselha centenas de CEOs e empresas globais. É integrante do Fórum Econômico Mundial e já foi conselheira do primeiro-ministro japonês Shinzo Abe. Autora de sucesso, lançou 10 livros fundamentais sobre gestão, traduzidos para 15 idiomas. Este ano, está lançando Redesigning Work, como transformar sua organização e fazer o híbrido funcionar para todos. E é sobre esse livro e também sobre o futuro da liderança que vamos conversar com ela agora. Lynda Gratton, it's a pleasure having you here. I'm so pleased that you have accepted our invitation.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Lynda, first of all, I would like to start our conversation asking you, what must a leader reflect today before thinking about redesigning work in his company?
Well, I think, the real question that every leader has to ask themselves right now is, how can I create a place of work where people flourish, but also where they're productive? And that's why in my new book, Redesigning Work, I talk about this as a design process, a process where you have to redesign work. So I think that the invitation to leaders right now is to ask themselves, how can I redesign work to make sure that people are both productive, but they're also flourishing in terms of their well-being and their engagement?
Well, after the pandemic, flexibility became a demand for many professionals. How could companies make it work intentionally to fulfill work and managers' desires?
Well, first of all, just going back to the question of leaders, one thing I'd like to say is that, every organization has to find its own way, its own signature. So what works for one company might not work for another. It's really important that you as a leader work out what's best for your company and then narrate and at that and role model it. But in terms of flexibility, what we know is that when we ask people, why do you stay in an organization? They very much like some sort of flexibility. And I think, that the piece to remember there is that flexibility could be about place. For example, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, I work in the office, or maybe I have concentrated periods of time, a week at the time when I work at the office, but I also have an opportunity to work at home, but in even a third place, perhaps even in another country. But it's also about time. And I think it's really important that right now, the leader thinks about how can we best spend time? Some people don't have any flexibility at all about where they work, but they do have flexibility about when they work. And so I think also asking yourself, should we think about flexibility around how many days they work or how many hours or whether those are concentrated? Because what that also means is that really falls to the team leader. And that's why you might have seen in Harvard Business Review in March of this year, Diane Gerson and I wrote a piece on just how pivotal leaders are and how important it is for leaders and managers to come to some agreement, some team agreement with their own team about how best to manage this new hybrid working arrangement that we're moving into.
Do you think leaders are more motivated to create long-term changes now and aware of the trade-offs with their employees?
Well, it's always difficult for a leader to think in the long term. I mean, I think for every leader, they're managing the sort of short-term issues. And right now, we're just coming out of a pandemic. We have a war happening here in Europe, and we have inflationary pressures. And we know that inflation changes the dynamics, the relationship between an organization and its employees. So, it's very important that leaders think about the short term. But it's also important that they think about the longer term, because in terms of their employees, there are some really important longer term trends that are in play right now. And let me talk about three of those. The first, of course, is technology. We know that jobs are changing as artificial intelligence and as robotics take more of the tasks that humans used to do. That isn't going to lead, by the way, to massive job destruction. But what it will do is to really focus on the need for employees to upskill so that they move to parts of the job that a machine can't do, or even to reskill, particularly reskilling around these new digital jobs that are being created. The second long-term force and trend that leaders need to be thinking about is demographic trends, and particularly that in many countries of the world, people are living longer, they're having fewer children, and so the population begins to age. And of course, we see this very much in Japan and now in China, but most developed countries in the world are going to age. And so thinking about how do I build an organization that's capable of bringing people in at whatever age is going to be crucial. And then the third is really about social trends, particularly the fact that so many women are now working and they're also moving into senior positions. And that means that as you are interacting with your employee, you might always also want to consider that they're likely to be having a working partner. And so how they think about the job and how they think about how attractive it is going to also depend on their partner, not just on themselves.
How companies can maintain, for example, creativity and collaboration in hybrid environments, which includes remote and present workers. What is this challenge?
Well, Stella, that's really the number one question right now. I'm in London at the moment, but I was in New York yesterday, and there's no question that right across the world, CEOs are asking, how am I going to make this work? Especially if I've got people here in the office and people at home. And that's difficult. And so here's some ideas. One thing that we're hearing is that people are saying, you can do focused work at home, when you're sort of looking at reports or analyzing data or trying to be strategic about a plan. But when we're in the office, that's the time when we want to be creative and innovative. So I think, first of all, it's sort of scheduling to work out when are people going to be together. And managers play a really important role there with regard to the team agreements. What sort of agreements would you want with your team about when they're together? But the second thing is that when people come into the office, if you want them to be innovative and creative, quite a lot of the office space we have now isn't really based on that. It's cubicles, it's people coming in, putting on their noise cancelling headphones and just putting their head down on a computer. So there's also a big conversation happening right now about how do we design office space so it's more conducive to innovation. So the spaces are more open. They're using technologies which allow people to be more creative. So I think that as we move out of the pandemic and get back to a more normal way of working, this question of innovation and cooperation is certainly going to be on the top of any CEO's agenda. And that's really about how you structure work, but it's also the design of the working environment, and the design of the office is going to be really crucial here.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about the working from anywhere that is here to stay? So are companies prepared to deal with this new workforce that we have seen?
Well, I mean, I think, let's first of all say that each company is going to make its own decisions about how it's going to work. So I was at a meeting yesterday where the CEO and chairman of one of the largest banks in the world, based in New York, said, I want everybody back in the office. If you want to have a career in this organization, you need to be back in the office. But at the same time, I also heard from the founder of Airbnb, who said, we encourage our employees to live and work in our Airbnb places anywhere in the world. So we'd like you to work wherever you can. And actually, they're noticing that people are using Airbnb as a place of work when they rent. So this idea that you could work anywhere, which is something I talk about in my book, Redesigning Work, is a very enticing idea. And there are financial industry, companies like CPP Investments, who are saying you can work anywhere you want. There are various tax implications that have to be brought into account, but you can work anywhere you want for up to 3 months a year. And so what we're seeing really across companies is each company is finding its own way. It was the chief executive of the bank, the New York-based bank, when he said everybody's got to come back to the office if they want a career. Was that the wrong decision? Well, no, because that's the role of a CEO, is to make those sorts of big judgment calls. And that's his judgment call. My question to him would be, are there really interesting people that aren't going to come and work for you because you don't offer any flexibility? But that's a decision he has to make. So I think we're going to see a great deal of variety between organizations. So not everybody by any means is going to say, you can work for anywhere you want. In fact, I think it's going to be a very small proportion of companies who have jobs which are analytical jobs, like Airbnb, like CPP Investment, where the real job is a focused analytical job. But I think any work that requires a high levels of cooperation, CEOs and leaders will want their people back in the office.
You have to balance the will of the workers and the companies. That's going to be the challenge from now on.
Yes, absolutely. And what's happening right now is that people are looking around for opportunities. It was interesting. The CEO of Airbnb said, the day that they announced that you could work anywhere you want, they had, wait for it, 800,000 job applications.
Wow.
Or they had 800,000 people coming to their job site. I don't know if they made applications, but they were viewing the organization. So that's a very enticing offer, isn't it? And so I think what leaders are having to do now is to say, how do I balance those very enticing offers, which people love the sound of, with running a company? Because lots of leaders could say, I can't run a company if everybody's in a different part of the world. That's not going to work for me. But there are companies where that does work. So I think working out how do you build productivity in your organization and still make sure that people are engaged and creative, that's a real challenge for every executive right now.
Well, many people, Lynda, is rethinking their connection with work after the pandemic experience, looking for purpose, fulfillment in their jobs. We have the example of the Great Resignation in the US. How companies can deal with this feeling?
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to redesign work. And it may be that you decide to go back to where you were, but every leader has to ask that question. Could work in my organization be done in a different way? Because we're now 2 years into the pandemic and people's habits have changed. Their aspirations have changed. Their behaviors changed. The way they look at their future has changed. One of the ways that I'm a psychologist, and one of the ways we think about people is to think about their possible selves. We have various possible selves that we could be, people that we personally could be into the future. And I think what happened during those 2 years of lockdown is a number of us said, well, I could be something different than I am now. I could be an entrepreneur. I could change my job so I spend more time with my family. I could travel. And in exploring those possibilities, as people come back to work, they're asking, is the organization prepared to listen to how I would like to work? And that's going to be important. And so every executive right now should be asking themselves, should I be redesigning work? Should I be thinking about how could these jobs be done in a more creative way? Is there a way that I could bring in more flexibility with regard to place and with regard to time? What are other organizations doing? Because there's a lot of experimentation going on right now. And if I was a leader, I'd want to know a bit more about that experimentation.
The whole of the leader from now on is changing. I
Yes,
understand.
I think the leadership role is changing. Many leaders are now going to be managing people not only who sit in their office, but also potentially people working from home, or indeed from a place far away from where they are. So that means that they have to be much more adept at managing virtual teams. They have to understand how to make team agreements. They need to think about, how do I really confront issues of conflict and trust in these new working periods. So definitely the leader skills are going to change. And what we've noticed during COVID is the leadership skill that seems to be most associated with productive teams is empathy and listening and talking to individuals. So, the teams that did the best were teams where they empathized with their team members, but also listened to them and had one-to-one conversations. These one-to-one conversations appear to be really crucial.
So you could say 5 crucial competences leaders must have from now on to deal with this new environment we are in.
Okay, well, here's 5. Number 1, be empathic with your people so that they know that they're listening to you. Number 2, be prepared to really build team agreements that ensure that people understand what they're supposed to be doing. Number 3, if flexibility is important, then role model that flexibility. If you want people, for example, to spend time at home or not always to come in the office, then you need to do the same thing. Number 4, be prepared to experiment. There's a lot of experiments taking place around the world. Take a look at them and see if there are other ways of doing the work. And I think number 5, and probably most importantly, be a purposeful leader. Be prepared to talk about the aims of your organization, to talk about why people would want to be in your company, what they would gain from it in terms of meaningful work. And I think this question of purpose is going to really resonate as we move out of the pandemic.
Redesign the work. All this redesign must be gradual, not to create great expectations of productivity. In a minute, you started changes. How should leaders deal with this process? And what is the risk that this process, when you're in a hush, in a few years, everything falls down?
I think that's such a great question. I've been a professor at the London Business School now for 30 years, and I know that you get all these great ideas and these new initiatives, but unless at the end of the day, a leader feels that this is helping my organization be more productive, then they all come out when there's a recession or there's inflationary pressure, all the things that we're beginning to face now, by the way. So how does the leader ensure that they don't do that? Well, that's why in Redesigning Work, my new book, I look at those 4 things that they need to be doing. Number 1, they need to understand what the job is. So if the job is a job where, you're simply looking at data or analyzing things or speaking all the time to customers, you can do that anywhere. You don't need to be in an office to do that. But if it's a job that requires high levels of cooperation and innovation, then you need to ask yourself, should people be in the office? So understanding the job, understanding the sort of people that you've got. So, for example, we know that young people really are wanting to come back to the office. Why? Well, because they're often living in small apartments where they don't have a great internet connection and they enjoy meeting each other. It's a very sociable time of our life and they want to observe and learn from others. So understanding jobs and people is really important. The second is reimagining. And as I've said, to be as creative as possible about time. Could I reimagine the times that people work, but also reimagining the place they work? And then the third is really modeling and testing it against big questions like, is this fair? Is what I'm doing are people going to feel as if they've been treated in a fair and just way? Are there red lines? For example, one of the red lines that we've seen leaders are creating is to say, everything we do has to enhance customer service. So if what you're doing now does not enhance customer service, then we can't go ahead and do it. And thirdly, how do you act and make this actually work? And the three groups are really important there. One, of course, is the leader in terms of their role modeling and their narrative, what they say about the future. The second is managers, and we think that managers are really crucial in making this thing work. And then the third is employees themselves. How do you give employees a voice and an opportunity to talk about what's important to them and how they could increase their own productivity?
Well, one of the negative consequences we see after the pandemic is the always-on syndrome that you wrote in your book. So emails after business hours, WhatsApp always-on, dozens of virtual meetings and all that. How can organizations redesign work to avoid that?
Well, this is such an important question again. And here's some really frightening data. What Microsoft have found, and they've looked at how many meetings we all have around the world, the number of meetings that we have had during the pandemic has doubled. We've spent twice as much time in meetings. So the first question that you should ask is, why am I in so many meetings? And stop going to so many meetings. The second question you need to ask in terms of burnout is, we know that humans are often at their most creative and their most productive if they're sitting on their own, undisturbed, working on a task. I'm a writer. So for me, sitting for 4 hours a day for 6 months is how I write a book. But of course, many people are not writers. But the same thing happens. All of us have high value activities we do at work where being on our own, undisturbed, is going to be really important. So the second point I'd make is, first point, half the number of meetings you've got. Second point, stop putting into your schedule time to really focus on your own, undisturbed, on something that's really important. And the third point I'd make is, as you work together in teams, ask yourself, do we need to be synchronous, i.e., as you and I are right now, where we're looking at each other, or could we just do it on an email, or could we just use a telephone? And what we've done during the pandemic is we've moved to this synchronous Zoom or Microsoft, whatever it is. And that's very tiring. It's very tiring for me to be looking at a little green spot as I'm doing and talking to you. It would be much less tiring for me to speak to you on the telephone, because I'm not then trying to look at myself and look at you and so on. So I think there are all sorts of ways to reduce burnout, and we can do it in the way that we design work, but we can also do it in time flexibility. We know that for people, for example, who really enjoy the morning, then giving them time off in the afternoon can be really important. The same for those who are most productive in the afternoon. So I think also understanding the individual's own scheduling can be really, really helpful. There's many ways to reduce burnout, but unless we redesign work, we'll only increase burnout.
Okay. Oh, great, Lynda. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this great knowledge about all this redesigning this crazy work we are doing right now.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.